increasingly clear that our current conventional and common ways of knowing is wrought with difficulty. If we take a look at what's happening in the world, where countries are divided, where the wholeness of the globe is divided into separate countries, and then the separate countries of the whole of the world is then divided into factions and subsets of different religions and different beliefs, and those then have further subsets, and with each belief system, the belief that what is known is the truth, and comes in conflict with other divisions. And it appears as though what's happened is that the separate self and the separate ego has become nationalized. And that the narrow way of thinking and the narrow way of possessing and the narrow options that the ego has on the truth has become prevalent worldwide. And that in order for us to have any kind of peace in our times, we need another way of thinking. We need another way of knowing. We need another vision of reality, because if we continue to operate on the assumptions that are already in place, the problems that are the consequence of those assumptions will continue. Einstein said that we can't solve a problem keeping in place all of the assumptions of the problem. So we need to go back to square one. We need to re-examine our basic assumptions about the nature of the self and the nature of reality in order for there to be a new way. Part of what inspired this particular topic was a quote that I came across that Rinpoche said. He said that in order for there to be a new way of being, there needs to be a new way of knowing. Now that was an interesting recognition that there's some connection between being and knowing. And examining, well, what is the connection between being and knowing is part of what prompts this dialogue that we'll have today. The self seems to be a narrow way of knowing. We could consider that. Incidentally, folks, instead of arguing for no self, which has been fruitless, I'm suggesting that we examine the nature of the self. So we can stop that argument right now. Okay? All right. So we're taking a look now at the nature of the self. And it appears as though one way to look at this, and what we're doing is we're looking for new ways of knowing, new ways of understanding, new ways of apprehending and experiencing ourself and the nature of reality. So the old way, the conventional way that we've all lived, is that we are a self, and that the self is a separate entity that has an identity, and that the separate self with its as an entity and identity is separate and apart from all that it knows. So we embody a position commonly and conventionally from a narrow way of knowing where the vantage point that's assumed is like a bystander. It stands outside of everything else. And the self is separate from the world it inhabits. And this experience that we have been actually taught, because when we were born we had no idea about ourselves and we didn't know what our name was. and we didn't even know how wonderful we were. Nobody, or we didn't know how awful we were. We learned that. We learned that. We learned how we could get approval, and we learned how we could get disapproval. And we've lived our lives wanting to be loved and accepted, and wanting to avoid pain and punishment. So if we're looking for a common theme, folks, here we are. We all want to be loved, we all want to be accepted, and none of us want to be hurt. The Dalai Lama says he's never met a stranger because he knows that that's the story of all of us. He knows that everybody he's met wants to be loved and accepted just like he wants to be loved and accepted, and everybody he's ever met wants to avoid pain just like he wants to avoid pain. And so, folks, we're in this together. So there are no strangers in this room. We're all sharing the same desire to be able to live with greater ease. We're all wanting to be more comfortable. We're all wanting to have a greater sense of acceptance. We're all wanting to have a greater sense of belonging. This is our story. And this is not our current experience. We live in a world where we are separate. We're wondering what people are thinking of us while we're thinking of them. But mostly we're concerned about what they think of us. Our usual thought about them is, what are they thinking of me? And what am I thinking of myself? What am I thinking of myself? What is my attitude and belief about myself? What is my self-concept? How do I think I am? And how do I think I should be? So we have a self-concept, and we have an ego ideal. And the discrepancy between the self-concept and the ego ideal measures our degree of depression. The further I am from where I should be, the worse I feel. What if those are mental representations? What if the self, as we see the self, as we think about the self, is a mental representation or a construct? Construct is a mental representation. We live the existence of interacting with mental representations, a representation of myself and a representation of the world. Representations. It's representations of reality. If we recognize that this is a representation, which we don't, we all know that we really see how it really is. And we all believe that whatever we think is true, regardless of what you think. My thought is true. And we have a thought and we possess the thought. And once we possess the thought, it becomes mine. Oh, anything that's mine must be defended, must be protected, must be perpetuated because it's mine and it belongs to me. So there's a me at the center of all of our representations. Everything points to the me. There's a me in meaning. The very center of all meaning, there I am, meaning it. This is not to be disparaging, this is just how it is. And if we recognize the way we're living, we can begin to challenge it, we begin to open it, we can begin to find new ways. We can begin to relax the self-centeredness of our perception. How to do that? How to do that? One way would be to reconsider the self. So we tend to have this mental representation of the self be a thing. So we made a thing out of ourselves. We could start with, I am not a thing. But we made a thing out of ourself, where the self has become an object and a thing. And the self as a thing needs to be protected. The self as a thing needs to be defended. The self as a thing needs to be maintained. And the self as a thing needs to be perpetuated, which makes it difficult to change. Now, as a psychotherapist, people come looking for change. And mostly they'd like their partners to change. If only he would be different, then I would be happy. Or if only she would be different, then I would be okay. Or our children to be another way. After all I've done, this is what I get. Not a phone call, but a text. So if they would be another way, we would be okay. And this separation that we have, that we live, leaves us yearning and wanting more. And we're yearning and wanting more from the other. And we have lost contact with the wholeness that we always already are. The wholeness of our natural condition. By being separate and apart from, we've lost contact with an essential ingredient that is nourishing, that is connective, that is universal, and that leaves us, were we to access it, not wanting, not needing, not desiring, not yearning, not longing. Now that would be a nice condition, were we to be able to access that wholeness and fullness that is at the core of our existence.